So it's showing just about 2 minutes after the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome as people continue to come into the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Apologies in advance. I'm overcoming a little bit of a cold, so I may be coughing on and off throughout the workshop today, but I have a large cup of tea to hopefully help me through it. My name is Alexandra Towns. I'm the Research Translation Strategy Lead for Laser Pulse. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Riddering, who is the Research Translation Advisor for Laser, and we're both based at Catholic Relief Services in Baltimore, Maryland. We're pleased to invite you to join us today for a workshop on a resource we developed called Guiding Questions to Plan for Research Translation, a workbook to develop a strategy, implementation plan, and M&E plan for research impact and international development. I see the room is continuing to get bigger and bigger. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. We'll have a mentee exercise in a few minutes to get to know all of you a little bit better. But we'll go ahead and get started with the content. Before I do, and I hope that Priyanka is in the room with us today, we do have a third author. She is not going to be co-facilitating because she has recently taken a new position as Director of Research Development for the Honors College at Purdue University. But I would like to briefly introduce Dr. Priyanka Brunesi, who was a co-author of this workbook, as well as the larger study that contributed to the workbook. Priyanka, if you could just briefly pull up your video and give a quick wave so we're able to acknowledge you, and again, thank you, and make sure you're included in the presentation today. All right, thank you, Priyanka, again. So we can go ahead and jump in. Next slide, please. So for those of you that are joining a Laser Pulse event for the first time today, just a quick overview. We are a USAID funded project that focuses on bringing together researchers and practitioners from all around the world to really solve the large complex challenges that we face in international development. We have 6 core principles that include a network. So we have a large network of 3,000 plus researchers, practitioners, policymakers, et cetera, from over 74 USAID partner countries. We also work with teams to identify research needs in a number of countries all around the world. We have 2 forms of research funding, the USAID buy-in approach, as well as an RFA, a number of RFA rounds. Fourth, we have a specific model to research translation that we've called embedded research translation. That is the official strategy for Laser, as well as what we promote and support all of our projects to implement. You'll hear a little bit more about ERT in the presentation today. We have a focus on gender integration as well as capacity strengthening. This series is from a number of webinars that are called Laser Focused. Hopefully you've joined a few other ones. If you have not, we invite you to check out our past recordings as well as upcoming events at the link that Christopher Rice just posted in the chat. Through Laser Focus, our objective is to explore critical topics in international development, research translation, and project management by providing an interactive platform with Laser Pulse Network members. Next slide. So before we jump in, and I see a number of you have introduced yourself in the chat, we would also like to get a better sense of where you're joining us from around the world. If you have not yet used Mentee, really quickly, you'll see an address at the top, mentee.com. If you could enter that into a browser, we'll be using that for the rest of the workshop today. You can just keep that browser open and enter the code 83474054. The other option is Chris has dropped another link, the Mentee exercise link, if you could click on that. And we invite you to go ahead and put the code in and then drop a pin from wherever you're joining us from around the world. I see a few people have already started to drop pins, but this is really just a quick grasp to understand geographically where everyone is coming from today. Looks like we have about 4 or 5. If we could maybe wait for, I'd say at least another 10 or so, just to get a sense of where you are. And I recognize Mentee may be new for you, so there's a little bit of a learning curve, but hopefully you'll find that it's pretty easy to use. Just to note that it's completely anonymous. We don't know as we go through the exercises today who's saying what. It's just an opportunity to make sure that this is as interactive and that there's a back and forth exchange as much as possible. So let's see, looks like we're up to about 15 people. Again, I invite you to please go ahead and open up a browser, type in mentee.com as well as this code, as we'll be using this exercise and this platform throughout the day today. So it looks like we have a definite bias in the US. So welcome to all of you that are also calling in from the United States and the East Coast in particular. A little bit of representation in South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. But I know there's still about another 20 or so of you that haven't yet placed a pin. So I please encourage you to do so. I'll wait just another minute or two, up to about 20. Oh, great. I see Africa starting to fill out a little bit more. Wonderful. All right. Well, again, we'll be using this several more times today, so please keep that browser open. So quick overview of what we will be talking about during this workshop. And again, I stress this is a workshop, so we hope to engage with all of you as much as possible. So we will start off with an overview of the workbook. So a quick introduction. This will be more of kind of the theoretical background of research translation, as well as how we came up with the actual workbook itself. We'll then spend the majority of the time in an overview of how to actually use it, starting with number one, a workshop, and then we'll spend the most of the time in the guiding questions. Now keep in mind, and as it's the title of our session today, the guiding questions are what we really consider are the heart of the conversation around research translation, and they should really guide this whole process. So we'll have a number of interactive exercises using Mentee around the guiding questions. So we do invite you to engage with us at that time. We'll also be sharing an example of one of our laser pulse projects to walk us through thinking about how you may apply these questions in your own context using an example from one of our own projects. Lastly, we will quickly go over step 3, which is developing your strategy, step 4, implementation plan, and step 5, M&E plan. But since these are the more standard project management pieces, we won't focus quite as much of that on the workshop today, but note that they are fully built out in the workbook, and you're free to go through it in more detail. We will wrap up with a quick summary and then leave some time for question and answer. And with that note in mind, if you do have any questions, we encourage you to type them in the chat. We won't address them to the end of the presentation, but as we're going to cover a lot of material, we encourage you to go ahead and pose questions as we go from slide to slide. So I want to quickly mention the laser pulse project that we will be using today. The blockchain technology project, their main goal was to develop a smartphone application using blockchain technology for African indigenous vegetable value chains in Eastern Kenya. And for those of you that have participated in laser-focused webinars in the past, you should recognize Dr. Jessica Agnew as well as Dr. Rolf Hall, as they were our guest speakers for the January event. We do encourage you to check out that recording. And again, Chris had posted all of the webinar recordings earlier in the chat today to hear some updates on this project. It has now concluded, but it's concluded with laser pulse funding, but they're ongoing. So it's really great to hear about some of their impacts as they continue to move this project forward. So I've mentioned the workbook quite a bit, but I know that many of you may not have yet seen it. So Chris has now dropped the link into the chat. We invite you to go ahead and click on that and open that up and walk through it as we go through the rest of the slides today. But this is a quick glimpse into what the table of contents looks like. So it follows a little bit of what I overviewed the agenda to be today. It starts out more in the kind of theory of what is research translation, what is a strategy, what are different approaches. It then moves into very specific steps. We have a 5-step approach to developing a strategy that includes setting up a workshop. Again, that's the more classic part of project development and when you're in the project design phase. Then it moves into discussing the guiding questions, developing your research translation strategy, implementation plan, and then M&E plan. The remainder of the workbook is a set of tools, and that's where you find all of the templates for developing your strategy, developing your M&E plan, etc. And we will go through some of the tools really quickly today, but again, we won't have time to do that in full. So we invite you to start to leaf through and explore this resource on your own. So as we transition then into the more theoretical part of research translation, you may be thinking, why is this workbook needed? Why is this a missing part of the work that we do in international development, and particularly in research for development? Well, largely we recognize that research and researchers really want to have an impact beyond academia, but there's not always, and there's really not a specific process or any kind of guidance on how to do that. So we synthesized a concise step-by-step process for research translation. Ultimately, we pulled research translation into the project management cycle. And it's our hope that this will aid researchers as well as practitioners and broader stakeholders in strategizing and planning for research impact. Now, as research translation can kind of be a poorly defined concept, this is a really practical, tangible resource that has pulled it down to earth, so to speak, to make it a little more tangible, to provide some steps and some guidance onto how to actually develop a strategy and then implement it. So what is research translation? And I know that some of you also asked this in the registration. Research translation, depending on what discipline you're coming from, has a whole plethora of terms, whether it's knowledge transfer, technology transfer, participatory research or action research, or implementation science, implementation research, depending again if you're from the more medical side of research or agricultural side of research, or anywhere in between, there's a whole host of terms. To put it in the most simplest terms, we consider it to be defined as the application of research to policy or practice. It can also be understood as an effort to really close that gap between evidence production and utilization. So if we try to again, pull that down to earth, so what does that mean in terms of a strategy? We consider a strategy to be something that could be a plan, a process, or an approach on how you'll actually implement research translation. We've created a template specifically for this that's included in the workbook that Laura will briefly cover a little later on today. But for now, it may be helpful to think about a research translation strategy as something that describes your project's goals and objectives. And it really brings clarity to the challenge that your research will address, as well as make explicit the impact that you want to have. And furthermore, in research translation, you are usually working with a team. So it ensures that all of your team members also have a shared understanding of the project. And I want to point out that how you approach research translation will largely depend on your context. In the larger study that contributed to this workbook, we found that there are 4 interrelated factors: intention, partnership, context, and resources. And the success of an intervention in one place doesn't guarantee that there'll be success someplace else. So it's really critical that you approach your particular context when you develop your strategy. And I've posted a question again from the audience: are there different modalities for implementation of translation research by the level of socioeconomic development? And I am pleased to hand it over to Laura to address that comment as she speaks a little bit more about the range of different types of research translation. Still on mute, Laura.
I was talking to myself, everyone. So as Alex mentioned, in 2020, Alex, Priyanka, and I started a literature review on research translation, and we wanted to understand the different approaches to research translation to enable researchers and practitioners to design and implement impactful research translation projects for international development. And we used a multifaceted method, a scoping review, and a rapid review to review research translation approaches in agriculture, healthcare sciences, political science, and development studies. And so, drawing from qualitative analysis of 93 peer-reviewed articles, we propose this research translation continuum, which is on the screen right now, because it illustrates a range of ways to produce useful evidence and to collaborate with practitioners in research. We found that research translation is highly contextual and that it can be conducted in a variety of ways. Research translation is not a singular process, but a continuum of approaches from proactive to post-facto translation. Proactive research translation on the left involves intending and planning for evidence utilization before the research begins and ensuring continuous partner engagement throughout the research process. And for those of you in laser projects, any embedded research translation project is proactive because evidence will be collected with the intent to inform policy or practice. On the right side of the continuum is post facto research translation, and we define that as identifying and applying evidence to policy or practice after the research is conducted. So it may not involve engagement with partners or those parties who carried out the research. In practice, most research translation approaches fall along the continuum between proactive and post facto. So the research translation continuum is a framework to illustrate the range of ways to produce useful evidence and the range of ways that academic researchers and practitioners can collaboratively engage in research translation. And so the continuum constitutes two spectrums, the evidence utilization spectrum and the partner engagement spectrum. In the literature we reviewed, there was a broad range of ways to produce and use evidence and a range of ways for researchers and practitioners to engage. The evidence utilization spectrum and the partner engagement spectrum, therefore, are closely intertwined with an understanding of context and availability of time and resources. Although post facto research translation is furthest to the right and characterized by evidence diffusion and minimal partner engagement, this approach can be appropriate in circumstances where policy and science may be more impactful when separated. It can also be useful when practitioners want to find scientific evidence without engaging with researchers. For most scenarios, however, we found increased meaningful participation with partners will improve the potential to produce relevant research and adoption of outcomes.
Speaking of participation, we have our second mentee exercise. Again, it's the same website, mentee.com, with the same code. Hopefully you still have it open in a browser. If not, feel free to type that in now. But we have our second question, which is another pin on image activity. So you'll have a little blue circle and you can drop it down depending on your response to this question. With what type of research translation do you have the most experience? So Laura mentioned the two ends of the spectrum. There's the proactive on the left side and post facto on the right side. Based on your own experience and in your own work, do you tend to fall more on the proactive side or the post facto side? And again, you should be able to just take that little blue dot and just drop it someplace within the continuum. Oh, this is great. We've got a handful of responses so far. Looks like there are about 50 people on the line, so hopefully we can get up to at least 20 or so. But it looks like there's kind of a mix all across the board, maybe a little bit more on the proactive side, which is really interesting, much more on the kind of participatory, co-productive side. But there are a number of you that kind of fall in the middle and a handful of you that are also on the post facto. And I should stress that it's not to say that one type is better than the other. As Laura had mentioned, it really depends on your context and it depends on the specific approach that was appropriate for your specific context. It looks like we have about half participation, so that feels okay to me. And again, really exciting to see this range of experience that everybody has with research translation.
So to dig into the evidence utilization spectrum a little bit more, we identified 5 reference points along the spectrum. And those include impact evaluation, uptake, application, dissemination, and diffusion. And the reference points on the left indicate substantial forethought and planning to use evidence created through research and substantial efforts to make it accessible to practitioners. In contrast, the reference points on the right indicate minimal forethought to create useful evidence and minimal efforts to make it accessible to practitioners. And this figure can be used to reflect on the approach that's best for your context and tailor your research translation strategy and plans to the goals and needs of the projects. The workbook has the further definition of each of these reference points. Similarly, the partner engagement spectrum has 5 reference points: co-productive, participatory, consultative, transactional, and minimal. And the reference points on the left indicate deep and ongoing engagement between research and practitioners, while the reference points on the right indicate the least amount of engagement and collaboration between academic researchers and practitioners. You can tailor your research translation strategy and plans to reflect the approach that is best for your context. And again, the workbook has the definitions of these reference points. So Laser Pulse has developed an approach to research translation called embedded research translation, or ERT. And it's defined as an iterative co-design process among academics, practitioners, and other stakeholders in which research is intentionally applied to a development challenge. And the central aspect of the ERT approach is its ability to bring together academics, researchers, policymakers, donors, non-governmental organizations, civil society, and the private sector to develop research-driven solutions to global development challenges. The underlying philosophy of ERT is that research translation is most effective when it is embedded across all phases of the research project, from identifying the research topic to disseminating the findings for broader impact and scale. You can consult the Laser Pulse website to read more about the ERT model and access resources to support its implementation. So now to dig into the guiding questions workbook. This workbook focuses on harnessing the guiding questions to develop a research translation strategy. It's intended for anyone who plans to use the research evidence to inform policy or practice. By reflecting on the 5 guiding questions and sub-questions, this resource guides you through a process to develop a strategy. And the worksheets do not provide answers to these questions, but instead provide a framework to guide discussion with partners or stakeholders and increase the likelihood of research impact. The guiding questions are the basis for this workbook, as they can facilitate discussion and reflection on how best to approach research translation for a given context. We suggest you work with your team of researchers, practitioners, and end users to discuss the guiding questions. We're going to focus mostly on step number 2, because that's what makes this workbook unique. And the other steps are fairly common in project managers, so we'll touch on them briefly. So step 1. The first step is to design and plan for research translation, to set up a workshop to discuss these guiding questions, and then draft a research translation strategy. The research translation strategy design workshop and checklist can be tailored to the scope and needs of the workshop of your project. On page 15 of the workbook, there's a template on how to plan for the workshop. And on the next page, there's this checklist so you can organize your workshop. And we suggest conducting a stakeholder analysis in advance to identify the attendees for the workshop. And participants of it should be members of the research team, practitioners with contextual knowledge, and end users. And so aim for representation of researchers, practitioners, stakeholders, different genders, and different geographies. And then on page 17 and 21, we have the stakeholder analysis also. So this is step 2. And as mentioned, this workbook focuses on harnessing the guiding questions to develop a research translation strategy. By reflecting on these questions, your team can think through a process to develop a strategy. And the worksheets, again, don't provide the answers, but a framework to guide a discussion to increase the likelihood of research impact. In the workbook, you'll find 2 sets of questions. There's a set for situations in which you have collected data, which we call proactive research translation guiding questions. And then there's a second set of questions if you will collect data, and that's called, I think I messed those up. If you have data, you can do the post facto. If you will collect it, it's going to be proactive. So as mentioned, in practice, research translation is not a binary option. So a team could begin with the guiding questions for post facto because they think they have a complete evidence base. But then after you go through the guiding questions, you may find out that you actually want to collect more data, and that's okay, because the point is to think about what you need to reach your goal and impact. So the guiding questions should initially be discussed in the design and planning phases of your project, and the questions should be reviewed throughout because its information or learning can continue to inform the research translation process and your strategy. So each guiding question contains a couple different parts. First, there's a brief explanation of the question, and then there's a worksheet to fill it out. Within the worksheet, there's 4 different columns you can see here. There's consideration, and each guiding question has 2 to 6 considerations that broadly need to be taken into consideration while you're having the discussion. And then there's sub-questions to help spark conversation. And then there's an answers column where you can jot down what was happening in the discussion and action steps. And this is where you can note specific things that you want to add to your work plan or your strategy. Not everything's going to have an action step, but we left it there so you can think about it. The first question, who is defining the needs and goals of the research? This question is posed to begin reflection and discussion about the different ways that research can be initiated and the subsequent implications on how a research project is designed and translated. We encourage research teams to consider how the call for research by different actors shapes the overall project, including its goals, design, translation, ownership, and the uptake of findings. Researchers, practitioners, and stakeholders could have different perceptions in the intent and the outcomes of the research translation, and a lack of agreement in the intent and goals of the research translation could lead to confusion or possible changes in the outcomes of the translation. So to overcome these tensions, we recommend considering the alignment between who will collect the evidence and who will utilize the research. If there's alignment, research use is more likely to increase. Establishing shared decision-making early in the research project can improve the uptake of research translation. And these bullet points on the slide are just some of the questions in the workbook. I'm going to read the questions, and then we're going to watch a video from the Hall team and think about these questions as they explain their project. Who is defining the research needs? What is the goal of the research and research translation? Who will utilize the research? And our partner expectations and goals in alignment.
Farmers usually don't have market information getting to them. How much do you produce? When do you produce? What is in demand, what is not, what is fetching a better price, what is not. And number two, the lack of transparency. You go to the market, you buy vegetables, there is no idea, there's no information about this vegetable whatsoever. How they have been produced, where they are coming from. We are exploring how the blockchain technology can be used to address the trust among value chain actors and information flows.
I recognize that the video got stuck, but hopefully the audio was still pretty clear for you. So for our next mentee question, and again, it's the same code, same address, we'd like you to reflect on who is defining the need for the research. Based on that short video clip, and I recognize that this is a simulation exercise and we just heard about 30 seconds of this project, but imagine that this is your own project. How would you say that each of these three partners, the researcher, the private sector, and the end user, are they involved on the low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum in terms of who's defining the need for the research? So this is a question, as Laura mentioned, it's really around ownership and goals. So who is determining the kind of who's the compass for the research? Oh, Laura, there we go. Let's see, we've had a few people weigh in so far. So again, there's just three different individual groups that we're asking you to reflect on: the researcher, the private sector, and the end user. Who do you think is involved in actually defining the research needs for this project? And again, are they involved on the low spectrum or the high end of the spectrum? It looks like we have about 12 responses so far. And so far, it looks like end users, there's a lot of emphasis that they are largely the ones that are defining the need for the research, followed by practitioners, or sorry, followed by researchers, and then the private sector. Just curious if we get one or two more responses where this may land. It looks like it's sticking pretty still. So based on your reflections, and again, this is the kind of question, or this is the kind of exercise that you would have with your team. This one question, you may spend a whole day or a whole week and you would come back and think about it. But based on that 30-second clip that we watched, it looks like most of you are in agreement that the end users are those that are really defining the need for this research.
All right, so the second question is, who is included in the research? To improve the likelihood of adoption and uptake of findings, we recommend thinking through who's included in the research project from the start. It's important to identify the people or organizations that can be included in the research project to varying degrees. And we divide this range of engagement into two groups: stakeholders and partners. Stakeholders include community-based organizations, nonprofits, government, or private sector that should be informed, consulted, or engaged throughout the research project, and they're not direct members of the project team. yet they have valuable insights that could contribute to the project and have a major role in wider application of research findings and research translation products. And these people may or may not be sitting in your guiding questions workshop. Then there's partners, and this includes a range of people also from different spaces, and they can be directly involved in decision-making throughout the project. For a more detailed information on partners, you can see the partner engagement spectrum, and more of this is discussed in the workbook. Careful identification and consideration of the needs and perspective of a wide range of stakeholders ensures that research translation products are applicable beyond the partners directly involved in the project, and that they ultimately lead to greater impact. While there may be a wide range of stakeholders that the project could consult, not all of them will have the same levels of knowledge, impact, influence, availability, and interest in engaging with the team. So project teams need to determine the optimal level of involvement for each stakeholder. And STEM stakeholders should be informed, meaning that partners should communicate the research plans and decisions early and often with them, while others should be consulted, meaning that the team seeks feedback. And lastly, stakeholders may need to be more deeply engaged by partners to reach the desired level of impact for the project. And it's important to identify the necessary level of involvement of different people. And the slide here has some of the guiding questions to propose in the workshop and think through as we watch the video. Who needs to be informed, consulted, or engaged in the collaboration? When and how will stakeholders or end users be involved? And are there other stakeholders or partners that could be involved to improve research translation?
We've been really working in a strong partnership between Virginia Tech, Egerton University here in Kenya, and AgUnity. I had some interest in blockchain and became aware of the AgUnity app.
AgUnity is a technology company. We are serving the last mile. The last mile are usually the type of communities who are the last one who get to access services to finances or telecommunication signal, technologies to smartphones, for instance.
We started by surveying the producers, the farmers, the traders in the middle, and then the retailers at the end, and also talking with customers. And from that information,
Great. For our next Mentee activity, we will be answering the question, when and how will the stakeholders be involved? So as many of you are probably aware, stakeholder engagement is a pretty standard part of any project management approach. What makes it really critical for research translation is that connection between sufficiently involving those broader actors, those broader stakeholders, to ensure that that there's adoption and uptake of the research. The question really gets at the complexity of the who. And what we're asking you to do in this exercise is to try to determine the optimal level of involvement for each of these three stakeholders. So we have the private sector, which is AgUnity in this case, end users, which are farmers, retailers, and traders. What looks like we lost the slide, it's coming back. So there's three stakeholders, and you're asked to place them on that matrix of whether they're involved from the very beginning, whether they're involved more at the end, and whether they're involved from at a lower level or they're highly involved, if they're just informed or they're highly engaged. And it looks like, oh, we may have jumped ahead a couple, Laura. Should be there we go. Okay. And we should be able to sync it again. So we're asking you to place these three stakeholders on this matrix. So when and how should these three be involved? The private sector, which is the company AgUnity, end users, which are farmers, retailers, or traders in this case, and the government. Based on what we saw in that brief video, when and how would you say that these three stakeholders should be involved in the project? Looks like we have a handful of people coming in, and so far the government is landing just kind of in the middle, now maybe moving towards beginning a little bit. Private sector is involved from the very beginning, as well as end users. And all three of them look like they're pretty much highly engaged, or at least on the more engaged side of the spectrum. Whoa, it's coming down a little bit. Maybe I'm speaking too soon. We have about 13 people, so we'll wait for a few more to weigh in. And again, we're asking, where would you place these three on this matrix? Interesting that it's not moving too much. So it seems like this group is in agreement that for all three stakeholders, they should be involved pretty early on in the process, and they're all pretty highly engaged. All right, thanks everyone for your participation.
So the third question is, what evidence or knowledge is included? We pose this question so that you can take time to reflect on evidence production, so that forethought is put into what types of data are gathered, what types of knowledge are included, and how the evidence can serve the end goal for research impact. For more in-depth understanding of evidence utilization, you can refer back to the evidence utilization spectrum. Many scholars assume that the meaning of evidence is self-evident, even though there are many possibilities that exist for what constitutes evidence, including the distinction between social science and physical science, and the distinction between randomized controlled trials or ethnographic studies. Furthermore, some scholars state that the production of evidence is influenced by values, culture, and context. Therefore, evidence and evidence production are not as straightforward as they seem. Additionally, traditional forms of knowing, such as indigenous, community-based, or folk knowledge, are often overlooked or undervalued available sources of data. The discussion around the strength of evidence should not be a way to cherry pick, suppress data, or hinder the scientific process. Instead, it should serve to avoid bias and unintentionally overlooking relevant data that could inform or improve research translation processes. It's important to reflect on data, evidence, and knowledge needed to make the changes to policy or practice. So these are some of the questions you can pose in your workshop, and think through these as we watch the next video. To reach the goal, what kinds of data will be needed to produce? What kinds of data will need to be produced to utilize the research outputs? And what contextual knowledge is complementary to the technical evidence?
Here's a phone loaded with the Ag Unity app.
I've just bought her vegetables at 80 shillings. So she wants to give me the vegetable. We want to transact.
Essentially, each actor has their own unique QR code, and when a transaction is happening, the price and the quantity that's being transacted, as well as the variety, all of that information is entered into the seller's phone. Once they both agree that everyone accepts, they scan the QR code. Then when the buyer pays the seller, another scan of the QR code occurs.
They can actually see it in the smartphone, they can see their wallets, they can see their transaction history, they can show it to the banks for them to get some loans, they can show it to the insurance company for them to get better premium for their produces. The main objective of Ag Unity is to empower people through the data. Blockchain can be really useful because when we put an immutable ledger system where everybody can learn to trust the data, they can learn to trust the people that they are transacting with.
And for our next exercise, we ask what type of evidence or knowledge do you think would need to be included in this project? And we present only 4 potential sources of knowledge or evidence from the project. Again, just like the stakeholders, this is a small subset of the possible knowledge or evidence or data sources that you may use. But based on what we have here, so farmer income data, dietary diversity score, retailer knowledge, and trader knowledge. What do you think is more important, or where would you place it again on the low importance versus high importance scale for each of these 4 data sets? Farmer income data, dietary diversity, retailer knowledge, and trader knowledge. There's a handful of people that have responded. It looks like there are 3 definite pieces of data that are being prioritized more than the 4th, but curious how this may change as a few more people weigh in. So up to about 10, and it looks like so far most people are rating the dietary diversity score as a little bit lower. And the 3 remaining ones, so the farmer income data, retailer knowledge, and trader knowledge is a little bit higher. And interestingly, dietary diversity is a part of this project. It wasn't really emphasized maybe quite as much in the video. So it is an important piece of data. And this is very much is the type of activity or exercise that you would need to do with your project, because there's potentially 10, 20 different sources of data. You really have to be able to pull out and then make sure that you're having that really robust, comprehensive look, that you're going beyond just data that you can measure in a quantitative way to understand the broader picture of where you will be working and carrying out your research translation. So we're hovering just around 20. So I think that's a pretty decent consensus. And again, it looks like most of you think the farmer income data is one of the most important pieces of evidence, followed by trader knowledge, retailer knowledge, and then dietary diversity.
So the fourth question is, how is research translation planned? Planning early and deliberately for research translation, given the specific goals, context, time, and budgetary resources for a given project. Implementation barriers are the most salient obstacle to effective research translation, including high time requirements, limitation and constraints of key stakeholders, and insufficient consideration of local context. Early planning can improve the uptake of research. There are multiple products that can be created from research and multiple ways to disseminate those products for application and uptake. The production and dissemination of research translation results, however, can be costly and should be fully planned for from the start of the project. Those costs could include inviting stakeholders to a workshop, engaging with government officials for wider uptake, designing print materials or media materials, and without the appropriate allocation of time and resources, the cost of production and associated dissemination events could be overlooked, and the research teams could fall short on creating the translation products and dissemination events wanted to reach the uptake goals. So forethought should be put into budgeting time and resources for these things. So I'm going to ask some of the questions that you could pose in your guiding question workshop and think through these as you're watching the video. What are the political, economic, and social factors that can shape the adoption of research into practice or policy? What time and budgetary resources are available to support stakeholder engagement? And what time and budgetary resources are available for production, for product creation and dissemination?
Research I'm used to, what would have done is would have gone to the field, done our research, have our findings, write journal papers, write a report, end of story. But now with the research translation partner, when we are exiting the project, we will leave the farmers with real solutions to these problems. This really now makes research more interesting.
Okay, so for guiding question number 4, we have the sub-question, how much should be budgeted? And I really like this question because it helps bring a project's larger ambitions back down to the ground in a really practical way. And when I've looked at project proposals in the past, I can always tell how serious a project is by how much they actually budget for research translation. And that could be, we have, let's see, 5 different options here. That could be stakeholder engagement, even just regular meeting time, ensuring that the team is coming together often enough, professional graphic designer, product dissemination, and impact assessment. So based on these 5 different items, how much do you think, or which ones do you think should be invested in terms of kind of more money versus less money? Which ones do you think would be more important for the video that we just watched for that team to really invest in? That's it. We've got about 7 responses so far, and it looks like stakeholder engagement is pretty high on the list. Professional graphic design is a little lower. Coming from the practitioner space, being at CRS, I find that we take the professional graphic designer piece pretty serious. And I think we learn a lot from our social behavior change communication colleagues that those really high quality materials really matter. And we're just around 20, so I will take a final pulse check here. Looks like stakeholder engagement is the piece that all of you would prioritize the most, followed by an impact assessment. Interesting, probably a lot of researchers in the room. Followed by product dissemination, regular meeting time, and then graphic designer. And again, this is really a tug of war. Budgets are limited, and Oftentimes, it really takes a lot of back and forth and a lot of dialogue to come to an agreement on how you'll spend a little bit of money that's often allotted for research translation.
All right, so the final question you would pose in your guiding questions workshop is, how will research translation have impact? And the intention of this question is to determine the appropriate scale, audience, products, and dissemination channels that the research will have so you can have research impact. Understanding the level, meaning like community level, regional level, national level, at which the research translation needs to occur is important during the planning and implementation process, because users at different levels have different needs. Furthermore, as the research project progresses and more evidence is gathered, the translation products may change. If researchers or practitioners want research impact, they must think about the dissemination of the results and the applicability of the outputs to practice or policy at the appropriate level, audience, and channels. Therefore, consideration of the influences on scale, audience, product development, and channels can shape the outcomes and impact of the project. One participant in the webinar asked beforehand, how do you define research impact, and how does the workbook help to achieve it? Unfortunately, research impact does not have one definition. We think that it depends on the impact the researchers, partners, and users define in each project. So this particular guiding question is important to begin to fill out the outcomes, indicators, and outputs for the project. And I'll be explaining more about this sheet that's on the bottom of your screen later. But these questions then can set you up to have activities and indicators so that you can achieve your goals. So these are some of the questions you can pose in your workshop, and think through these as we watch the next video. What products are most appropriate for the audience to use? Which actors can influence the adoption of research into practice or policy? And how can change from research translation be measured and assessed?
Imenisaidia kwa mambo ya kutembea kutafuta wanunuzi. Imenisaidia kwa sababu nikiwa na mboga nitapika tu simu, Jemima anajua niko na mboga, ananiambia leta. Sitatembea kutafuta wanunuzi.
To hear that kind of immediate, tangible feedback is really impressive and exciting. If this project is successful, producers and farmers will have higher incomes from the sale of their African indigenous vegetables. Consumers would have knowledge and information about the value and would be purchasing more, which would in turn hopefully increase the nutrition intake of their families.
Great, so our final mentee exercise out of the guiding questions is, how will research translation have impact? And once again, based on that short video that we watched, how would you rank success? There are 4 different items here. The first being number of users on the app. The second one, improved consumers' nutritional intake. The third one being an increase in farmer income. And the last one being qualitative data on success stories of market sellers. So again, if you could rank each of these 4, whoops, looks like we lost the slide again, based on what you think that the team should prioritize in terms of measuring their impact. And like the budgeting one, I feel like this is another hard question, and partners may see things differently. The researchers may think of impact in one way and the practitioners in another, and a policymaker or a broader stakeholder in a totally different way. And you can oftentimes have a few different measures, but this is, again, one of those really important conversations to have at the beginning, as well as you go throughout your project, to make sure that everyone is on board about what success really looks like. So based on the 11 or so responses now, it looks like increase in farmer income has the most agreement in terms of what could really be prioritized in terms of measuring success. The other 3 are more or less even, with number of users on the app taking a little bit less of a priority. But I'll wait for a few more responses to come in, if we can hit just around 20, to get a better sense of the pulse of the room. And it looks like it's pretty much stable. Most of you are in agreement that increased in farmer income is really a priority success measure here.
It's fun watching the middle 2 go up and down. That seems like there's disagreement. That could be an exciting workshop. So again, we've gone through this part of it a lot, discussing the guiding questions in this workshop. And now we're going to just quickly touch on these next: designing the strategy, implementation plan, and monitoring and evaluation plan. These are more kind of project management skills, and we wanted to focus on this because it's what's unique about this workbook that we're offering. So after completing the discussion of the guiding questions, you will have a strong foundation to inform the development of your research translation strategy. And you use the answers and action steps identified in the guiding questions to fill out the strategy worksheet. The strategy should be a short document that enables all partners to clearly understand why and how the project will carry out. It will condense the key points discussed from the guiding questions into a broad strategy, and you can determine what you want to achieve in your research translation project. And so this worksheet on page 34 will connect the activities with the desired outcomes, measures, and indicators. So we recommend that you actually fill the columns out in this order. You start with outcomes in the middle, and then you figure out how you would have indicators for those outcomes, and then finally fill out your outputs. And that'll include the activities and the audience for those different outputs. And so the columns are interrelated, but this order enables you to think about the research impact first and to ensure that you have the activities required to achieve your goals. Step 4 is, again, based on the guiding questions and that discussion and the strategy that you just developed, you can plan for the implementation of your research translation project. So you can add the action steps and activities identified in the guiding questions with the research activities that you're going to do, and you can create a comprehensive implementation plan for your entire project. So you identify the months in which the activity will occur, add any budget considerations for those activities, and you can continue to review and update this as needed. And the indicator column for this is in the first column for the next worksheet, so you can start thinking about how to evaluate. So again, we want to ensure that research uptake and impact happens and is more likely. And so monitoring it throughout the project can help you to evaluate and make sure that that happens at the end. So this is, we call the research translation monitoring and evaluation worksheet. And it enables you to identify and track indicators throughout the project. And the worksheet includes determining the data collection methods and frequency, and establishing the baseline for indicators and assessing the change in indicators over time. So step 3, 4, and 5 can be completed in a cyclical and iterative manner to update and refine the strategy. And we recommend that you work collaboratively in a small group to fill these worksheets out, and it does not have to be the same group as the guiding questions workshop. That could be a bigger group, and then the people who do these smaller worksheets could be a smaller group. But it's important project management tools, and they can be updated in the regular team meetings that you have.
Great. We have one final summary slide and then one final mentee, but as Chris posted in the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat and we will answer them in just a few moments. So in summary, this workbook serves as a guide for any type of research translation, whether it falls on the more proactive side, like embedded research translation, or the more post facto side. And hopefully we've shown that the guiding questions are the really heart of the conversation. So these 5 questions are what can guide you to arrive at a really strong foundation where you can develop your strategy, your implementation plan, as well as your M&E plan. And lastly, the tools that Laura went over quickly at the end, they're something that can be updated as part of regular team meetings. So they're not designed to be a very static one-time kind of activity, but something that you go back and improve and iterate on and as you complete your project. So for our very last mentee exercise, and that leaves us with about 5 minutes left for Q&A, we would like to know, based on the information that you've heard, and I recognize you haven't had really a deep dive into this whole workbook, but we would like to know, do you see yourself using this workbook in your own work? Is it something that, yes, right away you think it's applicable, or maybe in the future, or no, it's not really relevant to what you're working on at this time, or maybe it depends if you could understand a little bit more what the the questions are and how it may be applicable. We've got about 11 people, if we could have a few more weigh in. And again, I don't see any questions in the chat. I know we had a few in the registration form, so we could go to those, but we do have about 5 minutes left to answer any questions that you may have. Well, there's one that came in right now, so I can answer that one quickly. How do we access the workbook? I know, Chris, you dropped the chat in earlier on, but if you could there it is. That was fast before I even responded completely. It's freely available on our website. It's a PDF. You're welcome to download it. All of the forms that Laura showed that you can actually write text in. Of course, you can also copy them or use them as it's most useful to you. But we really hope that this is something useful. It looks like at least the 11 of you that responded feels like it's something you can apply right away or maybe in the future. But hopefully it really tries to fill that gap of being able to put research translation into practice for research and international development. And any other questions? We still have a few moments. I know we could go to a few of the questions that were in the registration. Let's see if I can pull them up really quick. I know there was one around the role of CRS and enhancing implementation research. So in terms of our role on Laser Pulse, both Laura and myself, as well as Christopher Rice, who's been monitoring the chat and writing all of the text, we are the embedded research translation team. So we have not only created the embedded research translation model for all of our Laser Pulse projects, but it's something that we try to build capacity for across our broader network. We also support all of our projects, helping them think through their strategy. We also have our own M&E activities around all the projects to understand how ERT is working, as it's an innovative and a new model. So CRS has a large role in Laser Pulse and ensuring that research translation is applied and it's really effective. But as CRS as an agency, we also have, actually I saw her earlier on the line today, but we have a team that works with researchers and universities all around the world, as we see research something that's really critical to improving and informing our own work. Let's see, there's one other question. What helps change attitude and behavior of policymakers? Ooh, that's a good question. And I feel like another good one for our social behavior change communication colleagues. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, Laura, if you have any immediate thoughts on that one, but I think being able to change behaviors and attitude of individuals, you really have to know them and have a relationship with them. So understanding what their pains are and the sense of what they would really like to have changed or what they see as priorities, understanding what their resources are, what they're actually capable of doing. I think it's having that deeper collaboration, a deeper understanding of where they're coming from, that you'll be more effective in changing their attitudes and their ability, as well as their potential to be able to pick up and apply research. I see, let's see, there's a lot of just general thank yous, and they found it relevant and helpful. And let's see, I know Chris, you posted another link there. And as we do wrap up, I encourage you to check out all of our other resources. We have a whole host of different capacity strengthening resources, whether it's courses. We have an embedded research translation course. We have a lot of short courses around kind of more interesting pieces, smaller chunks of research translation, like Nudge, or a whole range of tools around communication. And I think we have maybe about 30 seconds or so, but just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Once again, we hope the workbook is helpful. We hope this workshop has been helpful. This has been recorded. You can access it on our Laser Pulse website. It'll probably take a day or two before it's up there. But good luck, and we wish you the best in not only designing, but also implementing research translation wherever you're working around the world. So thank you again, and take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.